All right, everyone. Normally, our president, Jeff Hallstrom, would be here to kick off our meeting, but I am filling in for him tonight, so I will read what he normally states. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I am Tom Gimicello, a board member of the Audubon Society, the Green Mountain one, a chapter of the National Audubon Society covering Franklin, Grand Island, Chittenden counties in Vermont. If you receive the Audubon magazine and live in one of those counties, you are most likely a member of Green Mountain Audubon. Thank you. If you're interested in joining and aren't currently a member, in the chat, you'll see that I posted a link to membership and donations, which allows you to get more information and join our chapter. Our chapter is based in northwestern Vermont, a region which has been sacred to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share this place and to work to protect it. I would like to also now call your attention to a couple of programs which will be coming up. Tonight is the last program that Green Mountain Audubon is responsible for itself, and we have partnered with a couple different organizations. So one of the things that I wanted to point out to you is that we have two programs coming up. And we have a program that we're co-sponsoring with North Branch Nature Center. It's Wednesday, March 23rd. Don't worry about writing everything down. It's all on the events tab of our website, which I hope you will go and check out. That is at 6 o'clock. We also are co-sponsoring with the Friends of Missisquoi, who are hosting a great program called Timber Doodles with Liam Berrigan, and that is April 21st. Okay, so we have a lot of things going on. Our program chair would like also to inform you that we have just received a really interesting request for support to support what is being called the Wood Duck Box Project by the Catamount Community Forest. They have turned to Audubon and asked us if we would help them purchase the materials to construct the nesting boxes for wood ducks on the pond there. And the total request is $321. So we are hoping tonight, if you enjoy the presentation and have enjoyed the other three that Maeve has done for us, and would be joining us in our real world events, our walks and our excursions, if you consider helping us out, because what we decided is that we will fund any outstanding balance that we receive, and we really want to make this Wood Duck Box project go forward. Tonight, Maeve is ending her fourth program in the series, and it's called What's in a Name. And I'm going to read what we had on our website because I think it's a great introduction. Then I'll introduce her personally. Most of us have found ourselves wondering, how on earth did that bird get that name? Join us for a fascinating look into bird names you have, what they mean, where they're coming from. And I'm wearing about 3 different hats, so I'm going to just pause for 5 seconds and make sure everybody's in the room, and they are. I have known Maeve since the 80s. I taught both of her daughters, and I asked her in 2008 if she would help me become a birder, and she's so successful that I'm now on the Green Mountain Audubon Society and was out today in this beautiful weather looking at the male Eurasian widgeon over on Pine Island Road in Colchester. So again, we have a donation button and we would love you to help us out. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Maeve. One thing, I've asked Maeve how she wants to do the questions tonight, and all you need to do is type your question into the chat. I will get your question. Halfway through, we're going to stop for questions, and at the end, we'll be able to take more questions. So having said that, thank you for your patience. Here is our presenter, Maeve Kim.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. I want to say something about names before we even start talking about names. And that is, my name, Maeve, is one of the 2 spellings of the Irish Queen of the Fairies. So I got an email from a friend a couple of days ago reminding me that I absolutely had to wear green today, which I hadn't even thought of. So I have green beads and a green scarf and even green earrings to celebrate my Irish heritage. So what is in a name? Why and how are birds called what they're called? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. That's what the bard says. Well, my apologies to the bard, because that isn't true. Names do matter, and names confuse us, and names mislead us. Take a look at these ring-necked ducks. There are nice rings around their necks, right? Around their bills, there really are. But around their necks, you would have to be holding a male ring-necked duck in your hand, and he'd have to be in breeding plumage, and you'd have to gently blow the feathers apart at his neck, and there, voila, a ring, a blurry chestnut-colored collar. Well, with this glorious ring-necked pheasant, the ring is obvious, not with that duck. Or take a look at this red-bellied woodpecker, not a sign of a red belly. In fact, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, an organization that has some of the top bird experts in the whole world, doesn't even mention the red belly. It says, these are medium-sized black and white barred woodpeckers with pale bellies. And it adds that some of the birds have a faint blush on the belly. But that is a ridiculously minor characteristic to find its way into the bird's name. So this evening, we'll spend time with several birds that are just plain misnamed. And we'll also see some birds that, luckily for us humans, have names that fit them perfectly. And we'll talk about how the birds got those names, some of which fit so well and some of which really don't. I think most people know that every living thing, flora or fauna, is given a scientific name. It's usually two Latin words or two words from some other language that have been sort of Latinized. And it's called binomial nomenclature, or naming with two words. Well, the Latin name of the familiar American robin often evokes giggles from middle school kids. It's Turdus migratorius. And the second part, migratorius, is logical. The first part comes from the Latin word for thrush, which is Turdus. The first word of every binomial nomenclature is the genus to which that living thing belongs. And the second word is a specific name identifying that specific member of the genus or the species. We bird watchers are Homo sapiens because we're part of the genus Homo, along with great apes and several extinct human-like ancestors. And the sapiens part comes because we're supposedly smart or wise or sapient. Some people know the Latin name of almost every bird they see and enjoy. I don't. I know only a few. I know names that really caught my attention and lodged in my memory. These are lovely little harlequin ducks, a species that's rarely seen here in Vermont. And they are Histrionicus histrionicus, apparently because of the melodramatic noises made by a flock of them together. It's just a great name. It's a serious Latin name that sounds whimsical. Another Latin name I never forgot after I heard it belongs to a bird I've never seen, the black-tailed godwit, Limosa limosa. That's a lovely name. It sort of rolls off the tongue. And I think only one of that Eurasian species has ever been seen in Vermont. It was a wanderer that delighted many birders back in 2007 when it showed up south of Middlebury and hung around for a few days. So I haven't seen a Limosa limosa, but I have seen several relatives several times, and that's the Limosa haemastica, or Hudsonian Godwit. That genus name, Limosa, means mud or muddy. And I couldn't discover when I was researching for this program whether that refers to the gray-brown color or to the bird's feeding behavior and their preferred habitat. Because all members of the Godwit family spend most of their lives on mud flats that are covered with shallow water. and they probe with those long bills for invertebrates to eat. The specific name, that Haemastica, for the Hudsonian Godwit means bloody, because when they're in breeding plumage, they have beautiful rust or reddish colors on their bellies. Up until just a few hundred years ago, people called these birds red-breasted godwits. And that brings us to common names, like the common name red-breasted godwit. Binomial nomenclature, the Latin names for living things, has a certain logic. The parts have to be in a specific order, and they're agreed on by groups of scientists. Common names, on the other hand, develop over time without any planning, without any specific order or system, and they actually can be different in different locations. The name Godwit itself, the common name, has sort of murky origins. It might come from Old English words of good and white. This is W-I-G-H-T, which means a creature, or it might be an imitation of the bird's call. And the Hudsonian part just is because these birds breed very far north around Hudson Bay. Common English language names are what people started calling the birds in Europe way back in the Middle Ages, or they're what the first Europeans to visit North America or Asia or South America decided on when they started seeing unfamiliar birds. But of course, North American birds had names, common names, way before European colonization. The people who lived here before white Europeans came named the wildlife around them. And often those names provided some information about the wildlife's habitat or appearance or behavior. For example, there's a tribe in North Dakota that has very similar sounding names for gray catbirds and brown thrashers. These are two species that keep up running commentaries that can last many minutes. And the word was tehubheglala, which means to chatter with one's own teeth. And then an extra syllable was stuck on the end of that, a syllable that meant brown if they were talking about the thrasher, and one that meant gray if they were talking about the catbird. And Chippewas called catbirds Mamadui Benishi, meaning one who cries with grief, a reference to the sometimes keening cry of the bird. And I apologize to any native speakers for my pronunciation. Unfortunately, a combination of factors prevented the already existing names from being used or even known by white colonists. First, many of the European scientists or naturalists, the people who traveled with early explorers, energetically just named everything they saw without even attempting to get any information from people who had lived with that wildlife from millennia. And this could have been due to ignorance or arrogance or both. Second, although some of the first European settlers made attempts to learn local languages, there were still significant language barriers. And third, very sadly, diseases brought with the early colonists decimated the populations of indigenous people, and in so doing, killed off an untold wealth of natural history. Now, I believe there's only one place in the United States, and it may be one of the best places in the whole world, to find many, many truly native names for birds, and that's Hawaii. I read recently that only 2 North American birds, 2 out of over 2,000 species, have common names that probably came from native languages. One is the sora, a long-legged swamp bird with a call that sounds sort of like a horse neighing, and the other is the anhinga, which we'll see in a few minutes. All of the other common names of North American birds were assigned to them by European immigrants starting in the 1600s and 1700s. And a lot of those names are just plain wrong. Here are 2 totally misnamed warblers. An early American ornithologist saw his first Magnolia warbler near a magnolia tree in Mississippi. And he announced, aha, This shall henceforth be known as a Magnolia warbler, or something like that. Actually, though, the birds might briefly rest in a magnolia tree during migration, maybe hunt for a few caterpillars in one, but there is absolutely no real association between the bird and its common name. Magnolia warblers much prefer dense conifers, spruce, balsam, hemlock as nest sites. And back in the late 1700s, a German naturalist collected, that means in other words shot, a small bird with a neat reddish cap on a Caribbean island near some palm trees. And he gave it the name palm warbler, which is really inappropriate. Palm warblers rarely spend time in trees of any sort. I don't know what that was, palms or otherwise. They are indeed one of our few warblers that spends much of their time walking on the ground, busily bobbing their tails as they go. And they breed farther north than almost any other North American warbler, getting as far as boreal bogs in Alberta and even farther. No palm trees up there at all. And in 1811, when early American ornithologist Alexander Wilson saw a small, whoops, for some reason it doesn't always want to turn here, saw a small gray and yellow bird near Nashville, Tennessee, he named it a Nashville warbler. Well, these little birds might pass through Nashville during migration, but they breed considerably north of here, and they winter there rather, and they winter considerably south of there. So many birds got their common English language names from where they were first seen and named by Europeans. The preferred habitat of a species can also be used in its name, as in marsh wren, or as in these lovely wood ducks. The one at the bottom left is an immature male, not yet as glorious as his father. And there are some other factors that lead to birds having names. Beautiful and dramatic green jays were named for their color. Whoops. They are gorgeous birds, as were blue jays and until recently gray jays, but they just got back their earlier name of Canada jay. Chestnut-sided warblers were named for the streaks of reddish brown on their sides. We saw this one carrying nesting material, which should be happening in about 6 weeks, I think. Yellow-throated warblers, I guess I'm still having that problem with jumping. Yellow-throated warblers, a southern species, and black and white warblers and black-throated blue warblers have common names that really do a great job of describing the birds. Ruby-crowned kinglets and ruby-throated hummingbirds, like this little male, were named for the patches of brilliant red in their plumage. Rose-breasted grosbeaks have rosy breasts, at least the males, and huge or gross beaks. And of course, these names, like so many others, describe only the adult males in breeding plumage. Female rose-breasted grosbeaks have the big bills, the gross bills, but not even a hint of rose. And female red-winged blackbirds don't have red wings and aren't black birds. Some birds' names came from colors that aren't part of their plumage. Greater and lesser yellow legs were named for long yellow legs. This bird, by the way, did have 2 legs. Shorebirds often stand with one leg tucked up against the body and completely hidden. Bird names can also reflect behavior. Catbirds make a noise that can sound like a cat's meow, and brown creepers are brown, and they do spend their days creeping up tree trunks in search of small insects. Acorn woodpeckers, a southwestern species, spend vast amounts of time gathering acorns. And then they store them in communal granary trees, 1 acorn per hole, like the one on the right. That tree had fallen down and was no longer in use. Black skimmers really are black. And they do actually skim. They feed by flying low over the water with those unusual bills open, skimming up small fish with their elongated bottom mandible. A quick check of eBird shows that none of these amazing birds has ever been seen in Vermont. Ruddy turnstones there do turn up here every so often. And they also were named for a combination of appearance and behavior. Turnstones feed by turning over stones and shells to find adult and larval flies. And in breeding plumage, they are gorgeous russet and black. Nuthatches were given their common English name from their behavior of wedging nuts into cracks in tree bark and then hammering at them with their bills until the nuts crack, thus hatching the nuts. And pine grosbeaks nest in evergreens such as pines, and they eat seeds from spruce and juniper, pine, and other trees. As this photo shows, they also love ornamental crab apples, especially in late winter, early spring, when other food is getting scarce, and those little fruits are all withered up and dry and soft and intensely sweet. Other birds got their common English names from physical characteristics that aren't immediately obvious to observers. For instance, pileated woodpeckers were named from the Latin word pileatus, meaning wearing a pileus, which was a red felt cap worn by some slaves. And there's other birds also that have names that sort of come from Christianity. Petrels, like storm petrels, walk on water, like St. Peter, and that was why they were called petrels. And cardinals have red robes, like cardinals. And there's a lovely little bird with the ridiculous name prothonotary warbler. Well, there's some debate about what that comes from. It either goes back to clerks way back in the Middle Ages in the Roman court, or clerks way back in the Middle Ages in the Byzantine court, or clerks in the Vatican, all of whom were called prothonotaries and wore bright yellow robes. Or the birds might be named for clerks in French Quebec and French Louisiana that were called proto-notaries. And this is sort of a dig at the proto-notaries. The civil servants were apparently given to saying the same thing over and over and over. So one theory holds that the lovely little warbler was given that name because it has a very monotonous tweet, tweet, tweet. Smaller relatives of the pileated woodpecker, downy and hairy woodpeckers, are named for the bristles around their nostrils. A downy's bristles are softer and more downy. Sharp-shinned hawks got their common name because their shins are oval, not round, sort of sharp when seen from the front, but it's a characteristic that isn't noticeable even in a close-up shot like this, or this close-up shot. I love this picture. This is a real action picture of an immature sharp-shinned hawk. It was taken by a Jericho woman right in her backyard, a woman whom I met in exercise class, not one of the more common ways of running into fellow bird lovers, but I think we're everywhere. And here's another bird whose name refers to a feature that's not always easily visible. Lapland longspurs are little birds that can be found in Vermont's agricultural fields during the winter, often just one or two mixed in with flock of horned larks or snow buntings. And we usually see them in dirt or rough grass left in agricultural fields, so it's hard to get a look at the characteristics that gave them their common name. So here it is, the bottom right there, an unusually long black toe, or a long spur. And this is a good place to mention, by the way, that there are a lot of photos in this program that were generously donated by fellow birders. And all the rest were taken by either me or my partner, Bernie Paquette, and with the majority being his work. Let's look at just a few more descriptive and wonderfully logical common names for birds. Barred owl. He's got horizontal bars, vertical bars, even some diagonal bars. Snowy owl. Snow white color, especially on the adults, which we very rarely see down here. And also they breed in the snowy far north. Snow goose, another snow white color, and another bird that breeds in the snowy far north. Red-tailed hawk. You can see the red tail in the picture of the flying bird. The young bird on the right had been caught in a mist net and had just been given a leg band. And it was just beginning to get its adult plumage, so its tail isn't as red as it would be in later as it got to an adult. And here are two logical names that reflect the bird's size relative to others of its kind. And that isn't it. The least sandpiper is indeed the smallest sandpiper in the entire world. And the great black-backed gull is the biggest gull in the entire world. And this smug-looking individual appears to know that. Some bird names are meant to remind people of noises made by those birds, and chickadees are a great example. Sorry, I'm jumping here. I'm having a problem with jumping. Chickadee. Many different Native American tribes used onomatopoeic words for these appealing little birds. Cherokees called them sikili or tikiliki, words that sound like the chickadee song. And eastern wood pewees got their common names because they're found in the eastern part of the country, and they hang out in woods and they say pee, peer. Veeries, a member of the thrush family, were given their common name because of the cascading downward spiral of veer noises. And killdeer were named for their cry. These relatives of shorebirds are almost never found at the seashore. They like driveways and grassy fields and golf courses and even flat gravel roofs. Willets, like killdeer, are in the shorebird family. And they also were named for their call. Wee willet, wee willet, wee willet. And whimbrels, even larger shorebirds with even larger bills, have calls that apparently reminded Europeans in the 1500s of whimpers. But I have listened to several recordings of whimbrels calling on their northern breeding grounds, and I cannot hear their whistles as whimpers at all. Willets occasionally show up in Vermont during migration, and an occasional whimbrel does too. I think there was one in Shelburne Bay last fall, much to the delight of local birders. Well, I'm just going to pause right here and see if there are any questions about bird names so far, and then we'll go on to how bird names can get changed and how they sometimes do.
At this point, Mav, we don't have any questions typed into the chat. And again, for anybody who is wanting to ask a question, simply type it in the chat. I will see it and I will relay that to Mav.
Good. So we will go on to part 2. We started this evening with some names that aren't particularly appropriate, certainly aren't very helpful, like ring-necked duck for a bird that you can't see their ring at all, or red-bellied woodpecker that doesn't have a red belly. So we might say, well, if the common name for a bird is so misleading, if it doesn't describe the bird at all, then why doesn't the common name get changed? Why can't we call ring-necked ducks ring-billed ducks, or maybe pointed-headed ducks? And of course we can, in our own names, or if we're birding with a group of familiar friends. I was once birded with a group of people who referred to these birds, American coots, as ivory-billed mud daubers. It took me quite a while to figure out what they were talking about. Because if we want others to understand us, we have to use common names that are common. Common names used to change informally fairly often, and they differed from different parts of the country. In colonial Virginia, for instance, grackles were called purple jackdaws, after a similar looking English bird. Killdeer were called chattering plovers, and northern cardinals had a lot of different names, including redbird and Virginia nightingale. But then in 1883, the American Ornithological Union was formed, and it standardized English language common names for North American birds. And ever since then, it has not been easy to get a bird's common name changed. And it happens only after a great deal of serious study and discussion. But the common names can be changed for several different reasons. Matching pre-existing names, avoiding offending others, new scientific findings, ethical reasons. I'll give some examples of each of these. North American birders and hunters used to call these birds marsh hawks. And it was a good name because the birds do hunt low over fields and marshes, looking for movements that might lead them to small rodents or possibly small songbirds. But our marsh hawks have over a dozen close relatives in other countries, and every single one of them had the name Harrier in its name. Harrier apparently derived from a hunting dog by that name. So in 1982, the American Ornithological Union decided that our Harrier species shouldn't be the only one with a non-Harrier name, and marsh hawk became Northern Harrier. And there used to be a small North American dabbling duck called a bald pate because it had a white crown. It's a close relative of this bald pate that was quite a long distance away from me when I got this picture. A Eurasian widgeon, and Tom mentioned that there's one in Winooski, or Colchester rather, right now. About 20 years ago, the common name of the American widgeon, or the bald pate, was made American widgeon. And I have to tell you, many birders howled in protest, and some duck hunters still insist on calling them bald pates. The name change for these beautiful little ocean ducks came about for a more complex reason. Until 2000, the common English name for this species was old squaw. Supposedly, early bird watchers, European bird watchers, thought that the ducks flapped and squawked like elderly Native American women, a rather insulting comparison. Well, normally, the American Ornithologists Union doesn't consider political correctness, not alone anyway, when deciding to change long-standing English names of birds. However, in the case of these birds, now called long-tailed ducks, the group said, quote, "The species is declining in numbers in Alaska. Conservation management plans require the help and cooperation of Native Americans. And the biologists were concerned that the name Old Squaw would offend the Native Americans." So because of this sensitivity, the AOU was willing to change the name and adopt an alternative name for these beautiful little ducks. And that name was already in use in much of the world anyway. The AOL readily changes common names when prompted by new and irrefutable scientific evidence. Some name changes have come about because of breakthroughs in DNA testing. And there may be some changes coming soon because of computer-assisted analysis of bird song. Scientific evidence can lead to what birders call splits and lumps. Sometimes what is thought to have been one species is found to be actually more than one, and so it gets split. On several trips to southeastern Arizona, I marveled at magnificent hummingbirds. I thought that was a great name for them. They are really mighty members of the hummingbird family, almost the size of warblers or even some sparrows. But on my last trip with Bernie, we saw Rivoli's hummingbirds, exactly the same bird, but the species had recently been split into two and given two names. The name Rivoli's was assigned to birds that found in much of Mexico and a few places in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico. And the name Talamanca hummingbird was given to birds found in Costa Rica and Panama. This decision, by the way, was not made by the American Ornithological Union, but by the International Ornithological Committee. And here's another example. There used to be, for decades, in bird guides, this really handsome big sparrow called a rufous-sided towhee. And then DNA testing showed that the birds in the western US weren't the same species as those in the east. So now we have spotted towhees out west and eastern towhees around here. Like the magnificent hummingbird, the species got split. And sometimes what was thought to be two or more species is found to be only one. So two or more get lumped. Lumping happened with the familiar flickers. The yellow shafted flicker and the red shafted flicker were discovered to be one and the same. So they were both given a new English common name, northern flicker. There are many reasons behind the common English language names of birds: geography, habitat, physical characteristics, voice, behavior. And there's one more that has become more well-known and discussed recently. Many bird names came from the names of specific people, usually the first European to see and describe that species. When we bird in the western part of this country, we might see Cassin's vireos and Hutton's vireos and Bell's vireos and Steller's jays and Clark's nutcrackers and Swainson's hawks and Allen's hummingbirds, all named for ornithologists, travelers, explorers, self-taught naturalists, even taxidermists. Bonaparte's gulls were named for an ornithologist who was a nephew of the emperor. And Cooper's hawks were named by that same Bonaparte to honor a friend of his. Baltimore Orioles were given their common English name because the colors on the adult males were the colors on the coat of arms of Lord Baltimore and his family back in England, where there are no Baltimore Orioles. And there are Wilson's snipes. I am sorry, I'm having so much trouble with going from one slide to the other here. There are Wilson's snipes and Wilson's warblers and Wilson's storm petrels, all named for a 19th century ornithologist named Alexander Wilson, that same man who misnamed Nashville warblers. And a few Western birds were named for people who never even saw those birds unless they saw a dead specimen at some time. Anna's hummingbird, shown here on a nest, was named to honor the Duchess of Rivoli, Anna, the wife of a European bird collector, that same Duke of Rivoli, who now has a hummingbird named after him. And here in Vermont, we have Bicknell's thrush, named for an amateur ornithologist who saw the first that he ever have seen of that species in New York's Catskill Mountains, and it got named after him. What do names like Bicknell's thrush tell us about the birds? Not much. In this case, only that the bird is in the thrush family and that an individual member of that species was shot, held, and named by a man named Bicknell more than 100 years ago. Well, recently, there has been a movement to rename all people-named birds, replacing those names with more descriptive names. In addition to the inherent unhelpfulness of bird names, or people names rather, for birds, there are several other reasons. First, we're all becoming more aware of the long ignored importance of indigenous people in North American history. As I mentioned earlier, our birds, quote unquote, had names way before Europeans got here and quote unquote discovered them. The birds didn't need to be discovered. They were already familiar to humans. They had already been named. They had already been studied. They were well known. They were parts of myths and songs and folklore. Calling bird species by the names of white explorers and white colonists completely ignores the fact the birds were well known way before European colonization. Second, research into the lives of the people for whom birds have been named has revealed that some of them were associated with bigotry, slavery, violence, racism, misogyny, other behaviors that make people very uncomfortable today. One example, there's a pretty little bird in the grasslands of central US and in the southern prairie provinces of Canada. And until very recently, it was called the McCown's longspur. Captain John McCown was a soldier and a naturalist in the mid-1800s, and he was the first white person to collect a sample of the species. Well, the same captain also led campaigns against the Seminole Indians in Florida and against Native Americans along the Canadian border. And he served in the Union Army at the start of the Civil War and then switched to the Confederate side. Well, about a year ago, the AOU, the American Ornithological Union, changed the common name of McCown's longspur to the much more descriptive thick-billed longspur. And one more reason that might prompt some changes in English language common names. Birding has to date been a predominantly white hobby, and we really need it to become more widely popular. Participation in outdoor activities such as bird watching has been found to be excellent for one's physical and mental health, and the US is an increasingly unhealthy nation. And as important, maybe even more important, watching birds has been proven to lead to increased curiosity about, and then knowledge about, and then support for conservation efforts, encouraging more of us humans to become interested in habitat conservation will be essential in the coming years if we want to preserve vital bird habitat, make a dent in global warming, and maybe effect some substantive change in this country's acquisitive and wasteful economy. So with that in mind, the AOL recently concluded that, quote, some English bird names might potentially be a barrier to participation in ornithology and in the broader enjoyment of birds. Well, a while ago, we saw 3 birds that have only one name and one word in their common names, and that's fairly unusual. Veery, Willet, and Whimbrel. Single names aren't all that common in the world of bird names. So let's take just a minute to celebrate one-named birds. Here are some that can be seen in the US: a few ducks, several shorebirds, a few raptors, and others. And the names in bold are birds that have been seen up here in Vermont. And even single word common names have really interesting origins. Anhingas, for instance, are really ancient birds found only in the most southern parts of the eastern United States. And I am willing to bet that this is the only North American bird whose common name comes from the Brazilian Tupi language. It means devil bird or snake bird. And anhingas swim with only their necks and heads above the water, so they actually do look like swimming snakes. Buffleheads are easily found on Lake Champlain during the winter, and they are apparently named for those big blocky heads, coming from an Old English word for simpleton. I had heard years ago that they were named for buffalo, but actually buffle heads were given their English name way before the first European visitors ever saw a buffalo. So I think it makes more sense that buffle heads and buffaloes both were named for their big blocky heads. Dunlins are dun colored, like dun colored horses. They're sort of gray brown. And the second syllable of their name comes from ling, which was an early English word part that meant small. So they're small, dun-colored things. And gadwalls are just one of my favorite ducks. They're unusual in two ways. They're a one-named bird, and both the males and the females have quiet colored plumage. This is an adult male. The drakes are handsome, but they lack the brilliant color of so many other male ducks. The name gadwall is of unknown origin. In mid-1600s in England, they were called gaddles and gadwalls. And some linguists say that the words come from the Latin word for teal, another kind of duck, but nobody's sure. And now to my nemesis bird. I know. They might be so called because they have a jerky method of walking, almost as if they're limping. I have tried to see this bird several times without any success. On 2 trips to Western Florida, I wandered on boardwalks in swampy areas where the birds were supposed to be common, and I never saw a single limpkin. Well, since then, my friend Tom, who took this photo, has told me about a surefire place to find and watch limpkins. And I hope to visit if and when COVID ever ends. Well, the word mallard comes from an old French word for male or drake, and everybody knows mallards. Even little children recognize them from the wonderful book, Make Way for Ducklings. Mallards seem to tolerate humans better than almost any other wild species of ducks. And they have provided genetic material for almost every kind of domestic duck. So they hybridize really easily with domestic fowl. This handsome hybrid hung out at the Burlington waterfront for many months, maybe a year or so, a few years ago. Osprey used to be called fish hawks. That was their common name. And they're still referred to as fish eagles in some parts of their extensive range. And I couldn't find any information about when the common English name was changed from fish hawk, which was the word, the expression that John James Audubon used, to osprey. There's some disagreement about the derivation of the word osprey, but it seems to come from an old French word meaning bird of prey. Ovenbirds are named for their little pizza oven nests, which they build right on the forest floor. 2 more one-named birds, and very odd names they are. Pyrrhuloxias, found in southwestern US, got their names from Greek words, pyrrhula, meaning bullfinch, and loxia, meaning crossbill, even though they really don't have crossed bills. Many birders have suggested that pyrrhuloxia is a word that should be thrown out, and the bird should be given their folk name, desert cardinal. Much easier to say and to pronounce and spell. Phainopeplas are another southwestern bird, and their name also derives from Greek. The original meaning is shining robe, which is really a pretty good name for this glossy, beautiful bird. And Tom, when you're in Arizona, you will see both pyrrhuloxias and phainopeplas, I bet. In general, I think the common English language names for North American birds are pretty bland. These couple aren't, but many of them are. Other countries have bird names that are rhapsodic. Hyacinth visor bearer, amethyst throated sun angel, glittering bellied emerald. I've never seen any of those birds, but on my one birding trip outside North America, I did marvel at a crested orapendula and a violaceous euphonia, a tiny bird with a very long name, and several delicate and beautiful little tufted coquettes. It is highly unlikely that the American Ornithological Union will begin spicing up the common names of North American birds with luscious sounding adjectives. We'll continue with blandness, but at least in the next few years, we might see fewer and fewer birds named for people and more birds named for obvious physical characteristics. And while we're waiting, let's celebrate a few more of these logically, well, that's interesting. I've lost screen sharing. There, I don't want to do that though. It's a different problem every time you zoom. It's very mysterious. Okay, logically named birds that either breed here in Vermont or pass through here on migration. White-throated sparrows, thank goodness, really do have white throats. Eastern bluebirds really do live in the east and they really are blue. Black-bellied plovers, when seen during migration, really do have black bellies, even though the black gets a little mottled the further away you are from breeding season. Brown-headed cowbirds, at least the males, really do have handsome brown heads. Purple finches, at least the males, are, if not truly purple, at least a gorgeous raspberry color. And common yellow throats really are common, and they really do have yellow throats, both the males and the females. Changes to the common names of birds might make it easier for us birders to converse with non-birders without being met with glazed looks of total incomprehension. It might make it easier to get younger children involved in birding, and easier for new birders of any age to learn bird names and then to feel confident about sharing their findings with others. So let's all eagerly wait for the time when more bird names in our area are logical and helpful and meaningful. Thank you all for coming.
Mav, we want to thank you for concluding the 4-part series for us for the second year in a row. That means that you have given us 8 programs, all of which can be seen if you go to greenmountainaudubon.org and you check our website. Again, we're hoping that you might, if you like the program, help us out with the Woodbox project for the Catamount Community Forest by giving us a little $1, $2, $5 donation. We would really appreciate it. We'll make up the balance. We have some events coming up. Please come and to our website. The website actually is being redone, and it's going to be, I've seen a preview of it, and it's going to be amazing. And we look forward to everybody participating. We do have somebody who did say, thank you so much. I definitely learned some new things tonight. And I can tell you, Mav, that I also definitely learned some new things tonight. And I promise you, if you get to Florida and you don't see a limpkin deer, I will put you in the car. We will drive down there. We will go to the celery fields, and I will make sure you see a limpkin.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody. We hope to see you out in the real world where it is spring. Good night.
Night.